A lot of times we are very concerned about getting content out as soon as stuff happens and making sure stuff is current. But I think there's a lot of value in looking back after something has happened and see what people haven't said or haven't talked about very much. That's what I'm going to be trying to do for future topics. I might call it Afterthought or something like that. But one thing that really came up, of course, recently was the Tucker Carlson Putin interview and subsequent events after that related to Russia and everything related to that wonderful country. So I thought that I would give a little thought as to what I think people have missed over the last weeks and have a little bit of opportunity to do that because Jon Stewart came back to the Daily Show and one of the first things that he wanted to talk about was Tucker Carlson's Putin interview. So a lot of good stuff that he brought up to sort of rekindle that fire and made me think about a lot of things that people haven't been talking about with this interview. So we'll get into it. I think the first thing that really jumped out at me was the sort of universal positive response, the kind of positive response that Putin got. And what I mean by that is that anybody who had a positive reaction to Putin's video, interview with Tucker Carlson that they put out on X and everywhere else, everyone in the world got to see it. And that's what makes this a little bit unique. But what a lot of people had to say was, oh, look at Putin. He has such an uh, dense knowledge of his own country. Our own leaders wouldn't be able to talk like that about their country, which I think most of us who paid attention in school would be able to tell us everybody the history of their own country. But especially if you run the place, I mean, if you don't know the history of the place you run, even on a rudimentary level, you didn't pay attention anywhere in life, and you probably didn't get to any elected office, to be honest. But a lot of people saw that as signs of intellect from Putin, and my immediate reaction was is that intellect is not intelligence in the sense that you can spout out facts as much as you want, but there's different kinds of intelligence, and one of them is social intelligence. And I think we've all been in situations where someone has started to rattle off facts at us for, again, Putin said he was going to take a minute to 30 seconds, and he took an hour and longer than that. Really tells you the kind of mentality he has in terms of giving an inch, taking a mile. He kind of proved it just from that sentence, like the way that he carried himself throughout that entire process. Um, but intellect isn't intelligence. There's different kinds of intelligences, and one of them is social intelligence. The ability to read the room and read Tucker Carlson, figure out, hey, maybe I should stop talking about this. Maybe this isn't what this interviewee wants to hear from me. But the main point is that rattling off facts doesn't make you intelligent. You could be spouting off Naruto lore and display your memory, which is not the same thing as intellect, just as well. And in that case, you're remembering stuff that never even happened in human history. Humans can't even do. Nobody is shooting off fireballs or cloning themselves. In the Chronicle of Yaroslav the Wise. It's very boring history stuff. To people who love history like me, or who have never heard it before, it's probably really interesting. But for the vast majority of people, it just didn't answer the question, why did you invade Ukraine? The other thing is that history is not destiny. Just because you can rattle off history and say, well, my actions make sense in the context of all the things I just said, that doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want so long as you can make your history make sense with all the history that you just rattled off. And furthermore, it was an incomplete history. That's the thing that I particularly dislike about Putin's hour and a half speech is that he left off so many things off the record, and I didn't really think that it was that good of a rendition of history at all, to be honest. It was very much textbook school for Russia, but it wasn't anything particularly impressive. And the biggest thing that Putin missed should be the thing behind me right here, which is, if any of you know, it is the flag of the Kingdom of Galicia, Volhynia, which is a medieval kingdom. Most European countries can trace their origins from a nationalistic perspective to some medieval European kingdom. And for Ukraine, this is the closest that they get by far to any sort of entity that really, really is firstly Ukrainian. Because, as Putin the professor told us, the entire space, the entire East Slavic space, was one sort of continuous entity under a very mythologized family. Honestly, one thing to bear in mind with Putin's whole historical rendition is that it's historiography. It's what the Russians believe about themselves and have believed about themselves for 1,000 years. So it's not in any way completely historically factual. Uh, Mythology is often that which is true but doesn't neatly fit into the historical record. We have to view that kind of history objectively if we're going to make sense of it, especially if we're viewing it from the position of two entities with conflicting stories, and whose stories conflict with each other's modern day aspirations. Above all else, wherever history intersects with modern politics, you're going to have to uh, go through the weeds there and make sure that what you're being told is uh, told to you for the right reasons because they're objective reasons. And Putin was not telling history for objective reasons. And this kingdom right here is a big, big piece of proof for that. Galicia Volhynia was a sort of family piece, a fiefdom in the feudal sense of the Rurikid family. And each of the three sort of Rusic populations trace their lineages back to one or more of these Rurikid states. For Russia, the country, the Russian Federation, and all reiterations prior, that is the states of Novgorod and later Muscovy. For Belarus, it's the state of Polotsk, which is a Russian city today, but was very, very powerful back in its day, was a sort of its own thing. And Galicia Volhynia, which was what it became was sort of the last outpost of Russia after the Mongols showed up and did what they do best, unfortunately. But this kingdom, Galicia Volhynia, was actually recognized by the Pope, the sort of the collective West, as we could understand it at that time, as the Russia, as Ruthenia, that's Latin for Russia. The West basically saw this entity as Russia after the Mongols came in and destroyed most other Russias or subjugated them. Um, this is actually historiographically very significant because it's the first time that a Ukrainian state, something that is uniquely Rusic but on the borderlands and recognized both by East and West as a distinct entity. Galicia Volhynia was the first state to do this, and it happened in the medieval ages from the 1100s to the 1400s, about 1300s actually, because what ended this state was the Polish king Casimir the Great, who after that time, the Polish kings had actually claimed the old Galician title of King of Ruthenia, King of the Rus, Lord of all the Rus. So these people, the Galician Volhynians, they believed themselves to be the last bastion, free bastion, in the best way, in the best way they could be, of the old Rus, which they viewed as being exclusively Kievan. In fact, one historiographically could call this state Galicia, Ukraine, or more accurately, Ruthenia, Ukraine, Russia of the borderlands, out of Galicia. This is all stuff that Putin, of course, wasn't going to mention because it directly contradicts everything he's saying. That Ukraine has no deep history. It absolutely does, just the same as any other European country. It can trace its roots back to a medieval state. And again, in Putin's rendition, he didn't bother mentioning that medieval state, and we know why. Another big part of Professor Putin's historical take on Ukrainian existence was what I'd like to call the Austrian thesis, where the Ukrainian identity was cobbled together from the Austrian general staff, or that's what he claimed verbatim. It was the Austrian general staff, not their universities, not their parliament, nothing. Apparently, it was a purely special military operation, the creation of the Ukrainian identity. But this historiographic understanding is very common in Russia, and it basically purports that Austria didn't have enough murderous Slavs, that Austria just didn't have enough problems, didn't have enough divergent ethnicities. It needed to create an entire new one. Is sort of the basis of the thesis that the Austrians just really badly wanted another language in their parliament to deal with. Um, it's very absurd from a student of history looking in from an objective perspective. The Austrians and the Russians were actually allied to each other for more than 100 years, from the War of Polish Succession to 1733 to 1890, which was the last hurrah of what was known as the League of the Three Emperors, which was Austria, Russia, and Germany, who saw themselves as the conservative, adult in the room, autocratic powers of Europe prior to World War I, who were keeping the Congress of Vienna, the post Napoleonic order. So Austria had a huge debt to Russia. In fact, during the time where Ukrainian identity was actually coming about, the Russians actually marched their army into Hungary to aid the Austrians in crushing the Hungarian Revolution. Not the first time they would do so, sending an army to crush Hungarian freedom fighters. Uh, Austria wanting that to happen again, or need to happen again, because they created another Slavic ethnicity called Ukrainians. It's just absurd on face value. No, the Austrians did not do this. It was not their intention or interest to create any ethnicity. If anything, they wanted to create loyalty to their own empire, which creating a whole nother national identity was not going to help that at all. Putin also implied that a reason for this, and many Russian historians will imply this, that the reason the Austrians needed the Ukrainians was to corral those pesky Poles. You know, we know that ultranationalist Russians really don't like Poles, and the feeling is mutual. But the idea here is that basically Polish people were just as rebellious in Austria as they were in Prussia and Russia, and that is just frankly not true. Very uncharacteristic of Poles to actually work with the country that occupies their country, but it did happen for Austrian Poles. They often saw Austrian rule as the lightest, the most dignified in so many ways, and especially the Polish aristocracy and upper classes, the intellectual elite, they were not particularly hateful of the Habsburgs. A lot of Habsburgs actually became Polish citizens after World War One, and would suffer greatly for Poland, actually. So the Polish and the Austrians don't have historic animosity the same way that Ukrainians and Russians have, etc. Um, the idea that the Austrians would need the Ukrainians to fight their loyal Poles is just absurd. It's a complete uh, either it's a lie by Putin and the Russian historians, or it's wishful thinking, or it's just a complete misunderstanding of the relationship between uh, conquered peoples. Because of course, Russia can never understand when a different group of people march into somewhere and are actually greeted with flowers. You know, why can't we do it? It works for them. That was really, in my opinion, Russia's feeling towards Ukraine, remembering the Iraq War. But one very important person who really disproves the Austrian thesis is Taras Shevchenko. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And he is a very famous Ukrainian poet who never lived in Austrian territory, was born as a Russian serf, was freed by his master. I don't exactly know if his feudal lord was a Volga German type of person, you know, a German settler, or a Russian, or some mixed family, because they seem to have a German surname. But he was freed by his painting talent. He was a great painter, a great poet, all kinds of things. And he recognized, being lifted up, that Russians do treat Ukrainians differently. He recognized that he was a Ukrainian because he was always treated differently, sort of a imported figure. He would actually meet one of the most famous African poets who actually toured Europe. It's a very interesting character. You all should look him up, Taras Shevchenko. And again, never lived in Austria, was educated in Poland, Polish Russia, it should be said, lived in St. Petersburg most of his life, was not even allowed to return to Ukraine to be buried, to pass away in his home country, even though that was his wish. Ukrainians, and he was born in, it should be said, the 1700s to 1800s. This is when he lived, and he's primarily active in the mid 1800s. Um, well, while Russia and Austria were still allies, and well after uh, Galicia-Volhynia, the Cossack Hetmanate. Uh, he's proof that people never forgot their separate national identity to Muscovite Russia, and it's certainly something that Putin seemed to have wanted to forget. Moving on from the 1800s, we can get into the 1900s of Professor Putin's historical dialogue with Tucker Carlson, and that is the complete misrepresentation of the USSR and the Russian Revolution in general. A lot of people who talk about the breakup of the Russian Federation today usually use states and maps that came about during the Russian Revolution, countries which declared themselves independent during this time. And one of those was Ukraine. Um, and before the USSR even existed, Ukraine was an independent country. And let me explain to you how that happened, because it's quite an interesting story. The SSRs, the Soviet Socialist Republics, which was the communist sort of foundational building block of political organization, these things were independent. While they were very much loyal to the Lenin regime, we can call it, Putin blaming Lenin for the existence of Ukraine, these places were independent. They believed in something opposite of what Stalin would believe in, which is called socialism all in one country. There was an opposite thesis to this, which was that each country should be allowed to exist independently as a socialist state and form a union of socialist republics. That's why it's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And this entity would not come into existence until 1922. Before then, there was the Russian SSR and the Ukrainian SSR. Lenin was not the creator of the Ukrainian SSR. It was actually a Volga German gentleman and other Ukrainians who they're fairly numerous because this state mostly organized itself in Kharkiv, and the rest of Ukraine at the time was either occupied by the Central Powers of World War II, or were simply not into the whole communist thing for various political, geographic reasons. So this Ukrainian SSR actually rose up with all the other communists, and this also took place in Latvia and Estonia and other places. There were independent communist groups across what would become the USSR and its later states. These places were, for all intents and purposes, independent prior to the formation of the centralized USSR. They even had seats at the United Nations, which, if we believe Putin, when Putin said that Russia is the successor to the USSR, that would mean that the USSR, Ukraine, and Belarus all had seats at the UN, but that USSR contained Central Asian states like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all these countries, as well as other places which are not Russia today. So if Putin wants to say that these countries all form Russia, he might believe that from an imperialistic perspective, but from the position of international law, Ukraine and Belarus were independent, United Nations recognized states before Russia even was a state, according to Putin, the USSR. Again, Russia did have a state, the Russian SSR, but for some reason Putin doesn't mention this. Putin doesn't mention the pre-USSR communist state of Civil War Russia. Whatever reason he doesn't want to mention this is probably anyone's guess, probably a sort of cleaning up of the messy history that is the pre-Soviet Russian times. He also doesn't mention the fact that, he talks about this very interestingly. He says, I don't know why Crimea was ever given to Ukraine, as if his understanding of nationalist boundaries and borders mattered to an international communist entity like the USSR. They didn't care who inhabited Crimea. To them, it was administratively sensible to put that into the Ukrainian SSR, which had been the practical case long before Nikita Khrushchev, long before the Ukrainian leadership that Putin talks about as if Ukrainians had always run the USSR. That was not true in the times of Lenin. There were more Jews, and on top of that, Latvians, actually. People don't talk about there were a lot of Latvians that made up the early communist government. This wouldn't be the case later on. Those Jews, those Latvians, other groups were thrown out in favor of ethnic Russians, sometimes Ukrainians, depending on how loyal they were to the communist regime. Uh, Crimean Tatars were typically looked at with suspicion because they were highly religious. That was the reason why these people were separated from the communist experiment, and therefore uh, Russian identity, ties to the land, and anything which would justify their existence in the territory that the USSR and Stalin didn't want. And it's quite unfortunate because it led to the genocide of hundreds of thousands, and that effect is still felt today. One minor note on the 1900s was Putin made this very easy to identify mistake that just very much frustrated me that I have to mention. He called Danzig, which is the port that my family actually came to America out of, as far as we know. He talks about, oh well, there was Gdansk, and then after World War II, the city of Gdansk emerged, or after World War One, a city of Gdansk emerged, and it baffles me because any student of history should know, no, a city of Gdansk did not emerge after World War One. The free city of Danzig came after World War One. And from Putin's perspective, this is, if anyone's confused about why he seemed to be very praising of Hitler, just randomly in the middle of the interview and saying it was Poland's fault for World War II, he's kind of tipping his hand. He really is. To his mind, Danzig should have been German, and Poland putting up a fuss about it is what made World War II happen. And he's seeing that with his own actions in the Donbass. It is fact. Danzig wanted to be part of Germany. It was mostly German. They didn't like being a pawn of political games between Poland and Germany. And there are about 90 to 95% Germans living in the city. So, by all means of international law, Germany should have been able to gain control of Danzig, and Poland shouldn't have been able to protest about it, according to Putin's view. This is a very harsh manipulation of national sovereignty. That yes, the people might want something in a particular territory. That doesn't mean you get to invade territory belonging to people who never agreed to that, who are not part of Danzig or Donbass or whatever territory is in question at this moment. It requires the consent of everybody, not just the people living in the territory that you can gin up. Most territories which suffered under the Allies after World War II, the Rhineland, Saarland, Danzig, Sudetenland, these places had heavy Nazi popularity because they believed in the rhetoric of returning to the home country. This was going to economically make their lives better, politically give them their social status back, everything they wanted. And I do think that Putin sees what Hitler was trying to do in what he's trying to do. But the horrible mistake he's making is that national sovereignty doesn't extend past the borders of the place you're interested in. You're not allowed to invade Kiev because there's territory in the Donbass you want. And that was a huge mistake of both international relations and just sort of basic common sense. You can't make a people love you by invading them. I contend that Putin lost this war on day one because his goal was to make Ukraine a stable, productive border state to Russia who would be their friend. And that will not happen, perhaps ever in world history again, thanks to the actions of Vladimir Putin. And now I come to what I think is the most important thing that everybody has missed out of the Vladimir Putin interview a few weeks on. And that's the fact that none of it matters. Nothing Putin says matters. And what do I mean by that? It's pretty dismissive, doesn't really seem fair, but this is what I mean. Everything he said in his answer of why did I invade Ukraine, it doesn't justify military action. It might, in his mind, it might even to somebody like me who understands history very deeply, who cares a lot about spiritual zeitgeist and historical patterns, and all those things that people who consider themselves, you know, intellectually inclined or whatever. I just kind of see it as, a deep seeing of reality. Uh, it doesn't mean you can put that on other people without their consent. They have to be inspired by what you believe to be the justification of your actions. And the world doesn't believe Putin's justifications, even if they understood them. And the sort of fake right on Twitter is correct, that most people don't know history. They don't know why things happen. But knowing why things happen doesn't mean that those things are okay. Morally, from any kind of philosophical or religious perspective, certainly not from a Christian perspective or any kind of traditional Catholic perspective. These perspectives preclude um, brutal invasion for the sake of your own political goals exclusively, and especially social goals. I don't even mean to say political goals exclusively, because these are not exclusive political goals. Russia wants the Ukrainians left on their occupied territories to believe in everything that Vladimir Putin is saying, to believe themselves to be long lost little brothers that need direction. This is almost the justification that colonial powers had towards Africa during their colonialization, this sort of benevolent overlordship. This is not a convincing argument in the 21st century. That, oh, you'll be much better off under my evil overlordship than your evil overlordship. It's like, it doesn't matter unless you're significantly improving the conditions for people on the ground. And that's, again, not just economic conditions, but social conditions. People have to feel as if it was worth it. And I don't think any Ukrainian, whether they were pro-Russian before or after or any place in between, would believe that all of this was worth a little bit of Donbass. When you could have just walked over a little bit to the east, just there's a border right there. You could have moved to Russia where you believed everything was okay. You didn't need to bring Russia over here. There was no justification for this. But let's say there was. Let's play Putin's game a little bit and say that Russia offers a lot more than meets the eye. Let's just assume this. Even though they've killed Alexei Navalny, even though they've killed Mr. Kuzmanov, whose first name I forget at the present moment, but he was the famous helicopter defector who brought a Russian helicopter over the Ukrainian lines and defected to the Ukrainians and became a sort of anti-Putinite Russian. He was murdered recently in Spain by, we can only guess, based on his enemies. Let's say that all of this could be ignored. Let's say that all of it is just par for the course. What do we do when we find analogous situations in other countries, perhaps countries that contain a lot of pro-Russian sentiment, like here in the United States? What if we had a population of clear others who had historic claims on our lands and wanted to take them back? A country maybe on our border who has a significantly huge population of their own people within our country who might one day want to take that land back, just as Russia did in Donbass. Who am I talking about? I'm talking about, of course, Mexico. Why, if you believe the Russian justification for taking over Donbass, then why shouldn't Mexicans take over Texas and California and New Mexico and Colorado and Arizona and Utah and Nevada and parts of Oklahoma? Why shouldn't they take it all back if one day they become, as they are becoming, the majority population in the country? in the state, in the region, in a place which might one day have separatist feelings, and look to Russia and Donbass and say, America, you said that was okay, so now it's our turn. I don't think people in America who support Russia are thinking in terms of decades or centuries, because that's the kind of thing that they are unleashing. If they truly believe, and if anybody truly believes, that Donbass had a right, or that Russia had a right, depending on who you believe instigated the union between the two, why not Mexico, Texas, and California? Why not the entirety of the Southwest? If the people who live there just want it, are willing to fight for it, they should instantly be granted what they want. And if anybody says otherwise, oh, well, they're doing something bad. They're contributing to a neo-imperialism. They're against decolonization, or any number of justifications. Mexico is a right-wing Catholic country. They should have the territory because they're pro-tradition. That's what a lot of people say about Russia. So, when will this dam break? Is a question I would ask any pro-Russian American, maybe any pro-Russian person on the planet, really. Do you support Mexico reclaiming its historic lands? This is something that already exists in the United States. In the Chicano movement, in Mexico itself, there are nationalist organizations who believe and maybe even work towards the same goal that Igor Girkin and other people, other Donbassy Russians, were working towards. But America would never tolerate that. At least, certainly not its nationalistic pro-Russian sentiment. The people who hold that sentiment would never tolerate Mexico taking a slice of their United States, especially their precious Texas. A lot of conservative people from Texas actually identify with people in the Donbass. They say, yeah, we were just like that. Yeah. Well, be careful who you compare yourself to. And be careful what you wish for. Be careful who you support. Because an enemy of an enemy is not your friend. He's the person who's going to make you look like an enemy to your friends. And that's what I see from pro-Russian Americans, or pro-Russian Westerners in general. They don't think about the other possibilities that they're creating decades or centuries from now. A lot of people who don't support Ukraine, I think, don't really understand where the Ukrainians are coming from. They contextualize this war as World War I, or any one of the wars they personally like, or see this war as. But I see this war as a war of independence for the Ukrainian people. Whatever that people is, and whatever independence looks like to them, this is a war of independence for them. 2022 was their 1776. And us in the United States, we were a proxy war, funded by foreign powers like Spain and France and the Netherlands, against the global hegemon at that time, Great Britain. Just like people accuse the Ukrainians of being today. America lost hundreds of thousands of people, mostly to disease. But that disease was caused by privation and blockade, misery that would have never happened if the War of Independence was not ongoing. Tens of thousands of American soldiers were killed. Many more than the British, because of the horrible conditions our army had to face. America was losing the war of its own independence for most of it after early victories, like you remember with Kherson and Kharkiv and Kyiv and all those early Ukrainian victories, much like our own. People forget that there was so much misery still to come after Washington crossed the Delaware. That was their Kharkiv, that was their Kherson, a victory which made everybody think that independence and victory was right around the corner. Read American history, it didn't happen. In fact, Britain took over more of the United States after our great early victories, took over almost all the South. That's what's depicted in the movie The Patriot, for what it's worth. America losing a war. Just because you're losing a war doesn't mean you give up, especially if it's a war for independence. You don't give up when things are difficult when you're trying to achieve your freedom. America didn't, and yet a lot of Americans want Ukraine to give up on theirs, as if we would have done the same. Can you imagine a Tucker Carlson talking about, oh, look at the huge American losses. The American colonies are losing an entire generation of its young men in a pointless war funded by foreign powers. Everything being said about Ukraine these days, negatively, could have been said about us United States during our own war of independence. And that's the biggest thing that was missed out of the Putin interview. How much America is like Ukraine, and how much America is not like Russia. At least, not in the ways that lead us to do good. Russia and America have a lot of similarities. They've actually influenced each other quite a lot, in ways that really merit its own video. But the way that it's different is that America is actually willing to listen to the world. Russia is not. Russia has no interest. And if you have no interest in being a part of the world, one day you might not be.